Okay, so let's talk about federal law, all right, as it relates to employment, all right. So we'll talk about two smaller ones, but the one at the bottom of the screen is is a big deal. So Davis Bacon, right? We can talk about that relatively quickly. All it says is that if you get government contracts, you need to pay prevailing wages. That's what's in quotes. What that really amounts to is you need to pay the average wage in the geographic area uh, in which the work should be performed to your employees. All right. Um, at least while working on the government contract. It doesn't mean if you usually pay lower than that, um, that everybody gets a raise. It doesn't mean that, but they may have a special wage, particularly for that government contract. All right, so that's all Davis Bacon does, right? And it goes deeper than the contractual party, because oftentimes with construction, there's the contract, but a lot of work is subcontracted out. Like if you're having a building built, um, you're going to have subcontractors do a lot of the work, and those subcontractors also have to pay prevailing wages, right? And there's a lot of um, compliance that contractors and subcontractors have to go to demonstrate that they're meeting Davis Bacon. All right, Wash Healy. All right, um, it's very similar. Requires minimum wage and overtime paid to employees of federal government contracts. All right. Um, there is a higher federal minimum wage, and that's what's relevant there. I think it's $10.10. It may have gone up, but that's what Wash Healy does. Okay, so the 800-pound gorilla of labor law is the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA. All right, so um, we're talking about federal law here. All right, so from a technical perspective, the Fair Labor Standards Act only applies to jobs that affect interstate commerce. All right, but I will say that that's a very low bar. All right, most jobs affect interstate commerce, right? Because if it doesn't, if it's a business activity that's entirely within the state, then that would be up to the state's labor board to determine what rules apply. But I will say that's an extreme minority of jobs. Most jobs do uh, affect interstate commerce. Because if you think about it, obviously at UC we do because we serve a student body that comes from internationally as well as other states. But even if you think about restaurant business, right? Um, if you work at a restaurant and you bring beef or chicken across state lines, that's enough. Or honestly, it's enough if your restaurant has a bank account with a national bank. Well, they're all either headquartered in New York or Charlotte, North Carolina. So that's often enough to say that this job affects interstate commerce because my employer banks with Bank of America, all right, or whatever. I just threw that out there. It is a low bar, so virtually every job is subject to the Fair Labor Standards Act. All right. Now, this is still part of the Fair Labor Standards Act. It did a lot. So child labor, all right. So the Fair Labor Standards Act. Let me see. I think I've got a year here. Let me go back actually. So the Fair Labor Standards Act was signed into law when labor law was oppressive. All right, there was no minimum age for child labor. All right. And so the Fair Labor Standards Act had a minimum age for children to have jobs. I think it was 16. Below that, you need a work permit that showed that the child was in school, not working instead of going to school. Also, the Fair Labor Standards Act created a minimum wage. And I believe when it was signed into law, it was 15 cent, maybe it was 25 cent. It was low, but currently it's much higher, $7.25. That's the minimum. States can articulate higher wages. Ohio has done so. All right. And it also includes a federal minimum wage, $10.60. I may have said $10.10 on the previous slide, but it's $10.60. All right. Also under Fair Labor Standards Act, the 40-hour work week. All right. So if you work more than 40 hours in any week, you're entitled to 1.5 times, or I should say non-exempt employees are entitled to 1.5 times their hourly wage. All right. So you can imagine the types of things that FLSA was put in place to counteract. It was put in place to counteract child labor. It was put in place to counteract low wages paid to those who had no negotiation power, no bargaining power. And it was put in place to counteract oppressive work schedules. You know, you work 60, 70, 80 hours a week and didn't get anything extra for it, right? Well, the Fair Labor Standards Act changed that. Now, there are some exemptions. When we think of the Fair Labor Standards Act, it was targeted at protecting the labor force, all right? Blue collar, all right? So there are some exemptions, all right? Generally, employees that are paid a salary, administrative employees, not your labor force, because just because you're paid a salary doesn't make you exempt. But if you're administrative and your job is administrative in nature, then you're likely, and paid a salary, then you're likely an exempt employee. All right. And then also management. All right. The idea is that the exempt employees have the sophistication to negotiate their own employment conditions and don't need the protections of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Let's talk about the WARN Act, which is the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act. All right. So this was enacted to counteract companies who lay off a substantial portion of their workforce with little to no warning. All right. So it's named appropriately. So what does it do? Well, companies have to provide 60-day notice before any mass layoff, and a mass layoff is defined as at least 33% of a work site that has 50 or more employees, or 500 employees company-wide. All right. So that's your WARN Act.